to pick up Mark here in just a minute. I wanted to do something I kind of told you about last week. When we talk about these different gospels, right, there's these different religious leaders that are coming in conflict with Jesus. And we wanted to say, who are these different people? Because they have different backgrounds, they have different political things that are going on, different religious things that are going on. And some of that is laid underneath what's happening. And so when a certain group asks a certain question, it means something to that group of people or the way they interact with Jesus. So we're going to go through some of that here as we get going. I'll skip ahead of this, and then we'll come back to this. So let me skip ahead here. So there's 5 different people that we're going to talk about. This information is from a couple different sources. It's from different commentaries. It's from Got Questions is a good place to go for some of that, and there's some other different articles and stuff that I looked at. So this is not mine. This is a compilation of these different things, but this will kind of help us understand who these different groups are. Like most major religions, Judaism is comprised of several different sects, and although these different sects are not the same as they are right now in Jesus' time, as we read through them in Scripture, it's helpful to kind of know what distinguishes them. It was divided mostly by their view of a literal afterlife and bodily resurrection, or whether they felt called to active or passive roles in the end times, right? So if you are actively trying to bring about the end times, or if you're passively sitting by, those are kind of 2 things that influence that. Also, where the political allegiance plays a big part into that. Josephus, an early Jewish historian of Judea, defined 4 major sects. He would say there's Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. We're going to look at one other one, which is the Herodians, because they come up in Mark as well. Each of these groups held power in either religious or political matters. And from a literal standpoint, Christianity kind of began as like another sect of Judaism, right? It starts off as these messianic believers. There were other smaller groups with different and unique beliefs, but we're just going to cover the big group. So the Pharisees, this is a term Pharisees often use now today as kind of a derogatory term, right? As a legalistic individual, and that's kind of how they were. The Pharisees in the New Testament times were deeply committed to moral behavior and a scholarly approach to the Scriptures. Their stance on morality included a rigid adherence to behavioral aspects of the Mosaic Law. So they were big into the law, big into following the law. However, since some of those biblical laws they felt were vague, they thought it would be a good idea to add extra stuff to it because it wasn't clear enough and there wasn't enough to try to work through. And so they added extra stuff to be more specific and to try to heighten their piety. Jesus not only criticized these Pharisees for their hollow legalism, as we saw in Matthew and in Mark, right, but also for the distortion of the commandments of God and following the tradition of men instead. And so that's kind of some of that theological pieces. Along with the Sadducees, they were one of the 2 largest sects in Israel during the 2 centuries prior to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. The Pharisees were the most popular sect in Judea, so they were very popular. They were involved in government, and in the community, and in religious practices. And so this sect was supported by a large mass of people. They believed in a combination of fate and free will, and that the soul is indestructible. So therefore, they believed in an afterlife. That becomes important later on. The Pharisees believed that evil would be punished for their sins, and the good would be rewarded, and so they acted accordingly. The Pharisees believed in a literal afterlife and a bodily resurrection of the dead. You'll see how that compares to some of the other ones and some of the questions that they ask later. As a community member, they focused on fellowship meals and followed the written and oral Torah. This group did not get along real well with the Sadducees. The Pharisees were the only group who actually kind of continued on after that Second Temple destruction in 70 AD, and then what became, that was kind of the group that would continue on in different forms later today. So you have the Pharisees there. Next we have the Herodians. The Herodians held political power, and most scholars believe that they were a political party that supported King Herod Antipas and the Roman Empire's rule over much of the land of the Jews from 4 BC to 39 AD. The Herodians favored submitting to Herod and therefore to Rome for political expediency. They supported Herod's compromised Jewish independence in the minds of the Pharisees, and so you kind of see where they kind of butt heads against each other a little bit there, making it difficult for them to get along with the Pharisees and agree pretty much on anything, except for one thing, which was to oppose Jesus. And so you have a religious group, you have a political group in the Herodians. Next we have the Sadducees. It's greatly believed that they were the Jewish aristocratic party and whose members were largely from the priesthood and the upper classes. Though less numerous and popular than the Pharisees, they occupied influential positions on the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, and generally operated with the Roman authorities. And so Pharisees didn't really get along with Rome. Sadducees did. And in fact, the Sadducees' primary interest often seems to be political, which made them useful conduits for the Roman authority. Of the four major sects of Judaism, the Sadducees were by far the most cooperative with the Roman Empire, and they were often accused of being brutish or rude at times in the pursuit of wealth and higher social standing. They were the most Hellenized or Roman of the Jewish groups, and we see Ananias and Caiaphas mentioned in the New Testament were of this group. So we'll see some of those characters later on. That's who these guys are a part of. The Sadducees differed significantly from the Pharisees in their theology. They believe that God is not actively involved with the world and that human beings have complete free will. They dismissed the idea of a soul and life after death and punishment in the next world. They denied the truths of the resurrection, future judgment, and the existence of angels and spirits. And so you kind of see where those two lay, because guess who's going to ask questions about the resurrection later on? The Sadducees. You don't believe in the resurrection, so they're trying to catch him. They don't even hold to those beliefs. They accepted only the books of Moses or the Pentateuch as authoritative and rejected the oral traditions that the Pharisees observed and focused instead on temple worship. So that's the Sadducees, and then we have two more. The Essenes, who don't come up too much, but it's in the same kind of realm, so we'll talk about them. The Essenes were a monastic group, and unlike the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Zealots, which we'll get to in a second, the Essenes felt called to separate from society in preparation for the end of the world. In broad strokes, the Essenes could be considered a doomsday sect. They felt the end times were imminent, and their duty was to passively await the apocalypse. Right, so they're just waiting for it to all fall apart. To an extent, John the Baptist was part of this group, right? He's this outside group as part of that. The Essenes produced written materials for millennia that were found millennia later, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so when you're a monk-ish, there's less things to do. And so some of the careful, tedious work of transcribing scrolls, right, was done by this group of people. These critical, important documents show how carefully and accurate the Old Testament scriptures have been preserved over the centuries. And then lastly, we have Zealots. On the other side of this apocalyptic coin, we have the Zealots, who were by far the smallest of these four groups. Unlike the Essenes, the Zealots were something of a doomsday sect of Judaism. However, the Zealots believed their actions would directly influence when and how the apocalypse occurred. And so Essenes are like kind of waiting off to the side, waiting for things to just take place. And the Zealots are trying to push it forward. They think their actions influence when that comes. And specifically, they believed they were called to commit acts of violence against Roman occupiers and to incite others to revolt. So theologically, Zealots were fairly identical to the Pharisees, except for their fanatical anti-Roman stance. Their view not only brought them into conflict with the Roman-friendly Sadducees, but it accelerated Romans' aggression against the Jews, culminating in the destruction of the temple. And so that's kind of what's going on behind the scenes, right? You have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all these different groups. And so when you see Jesus interacting with them, you can kind of understand a little better what's going on there. And so we said we were going to do that because we had people that were asking about that. So there's kind of the outline that gives us a little bit more on what's happening with some of those groups. If you remember last week, we made it partway through this Galilee section, right? And so we said that Mark is super short. There's the introduction. There's Mark's divided up more geographically, right? And so he's in Galilee for a large portion of time, and that really the question is, who is Jesus? Last week I told you that that section ended at 8:26. I changed my mind. That last section we'll get to, it makes more sense to put it in here because if the question is who is Jesus, that last section answers the question, right? So you can either put it at the top of the next one, right, or kind of at the bottom of this one. So I like it at the bottom. So if you looked at last line's out week, ignore it because I like this one better. So 1:21 through 8:30 is in Galilee. Then he's on his way eventually to get to Jerusalem. When he's on his way, we're really asking a question, what does it mean that Jesus is the Messiah? So that's kind of where we're at tonight. Again, Galilee is just the region over here. There's Capernaum and some other, the Gennesaret and Bethsaida and some of those other areas that we looked at last week when we go through that. And so we're going to pick up very, very briefly in part of chapter 6 where we left off because these next couple stories kind of go together. Our goal is to get through chapter 12 tonight. And so we'll see how we can do with some of this. But if you remember, chapter 6, Jesus is rejected there in the first 6 verses, right? He's rejected by his own people in his own town, right? Next, he then sends out the 12 there in verses 7 through 13. And so he gives them that same kind of, the same authority that he has, right? The same mission that he had. We talked about that. Mark 1 and Mark 3 kind of lay out Jesus' prerogative in the book, and then he picks it up here with the commissioning of these disciples, sending them out 2 by 2. You have this little intermission of the death of John the Baptist there in 14 through 29, and then the feeding of the 5,000 happens starting in verse 30. When you look at that, though, it says the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And so they're coming back from having spent time doing ministry work out, and Jesus is trying to get the report on what's happening. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away into the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot for all the towns and got there ahead of them. When they went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And so we said this, right? Like everyone comes back from their ministry trip, right? They're trying to get a download and understand what happened, and Jesus is trying to teach them and figure out what's happening. It's like, let's get on the boat. And like they're driving down the road, and like they show up at the next stop, and like a whole crowd shows up, and like, we can't even catch a break. Like we're trying to eat. We haven't eaten anything. We haven't had a breather, right? And now 5,000 people show up, right? And Jesus has compassion on them. And remember the story, we always remember bread, right? Bread's a side effect of the fact that they're there listening to Jesus because he has compassion on them because they feel like they're sheep without a shepherd, right? They have a spiritual need, and Jesus recognizes that, and he's meeting that need long enough that they get physically hungry. And so you have the feeding of the 5,000 there. We said that they're like, where are we supposed to go to get food? It would take $24,000 to go to the store and pick all this up, and I don't think Publix carries that much bread. And so Jesus blesses the bread, they pass it out, and then they go off. After they leave, Jesus sends them away on a boat because they needed the break that they didn't get yet. And so they go out on the boat. Jesus goes up onto the mountainside, and Jesus prays there. Immediately this is verse 45, immediately he made his disciples get up into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. And so Jesus is locking up the church while like the disciples go home, right? And then he goes up on the mountain. And after he had taken leave with them, he went up on the mountain to pray. So he's spending some time in prayer. He eventually goes out there to the sea and walks out to them. They freak out, thinking there's a ghost again. And he says, "Take heart, it is I." This is verse 50. "Do not be afraid." If you were to look at that, it's actually "take heart." It says "I am," not "I," which is a reference back to when he revealed himself to Moses in the burning bush. And so he's trying to communicate to them in both his word and his deeds that he's something else is going on. And when they got into the boat with them, the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So the disciples are not getting it still, right? Jesus is doing these things in the crowd. He's doing these things with the disciples, and they're still not completely comprehending what's going on. That's going to continue on through this section. As we read through some of this tonight, if you look at it, when you read your Bible, right, you can read deep and dig into stuff and figure out what do words mean and what's going on and why are these pieces together. And you can read wide. What we're doing is kind of reading wide and trying to get the big scope of what's going on, right? We're trying to get the narrative pieces together, see what's going on. And in doing so, you're going to see things that Mark does as an author that if you were to pick out these individual pieces, you may not put them together, right? If you focus on these little pieces or little snippets of stuff, you may not get all this coming together. And Mark, for being one of the simpler books Greek-wise, does some really cool things, which we'll look at. Jesus heals many there in the Gennesaret. Again, that's the place where the demon-possessed man from Mark 5 was. I forgot to look up Anne if he was Gentile or not. I didn't look, but I still want to know. I forgot, but I remembered, just not at the right time. If I would have remembered 5 hours ago, we might have had something to talk about. But he heals many there in verses 53 through 56. Chapter 7 kind of starts the next little piece here. The Pharisees start to complain to him about having dirty hands. Now when the Pharisees gathered to him, some of them and the scribes came from Jerusalem. They saw some of the disciples ate with their hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. And so verses 3 and 4 is Mark giving commentary on why that's important. The note for that is, we talked about before, what are some things that you see how Mark does differently and how Mark is writing to a Gentile audience or a Roman audience and not a Jewish audience? If you're a Jewish audience, you know why the Pharisees are upset because you know their extra traditions and their extra laws. If you're Roman, you may not know those cultural customs. So Mark's giving you cultural commentary here on what's going on. And so here's a little snippet on kind of that going on. He says, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews did not eat unless they washed their hands properly." So if you're saying the Pharisees and all the Jews, again, it assumes that you're writing to somebody else other than those two. Wash their hands properly, holding to the traditions of the elders. And when they came from the marketplace, they did not eat until they washed. And there are many other traditions that they observed, such as washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" So again, the tradition of the elders is that extra biblical teaching, right? Those are the laws plus that they're doing, right? And then that's what they're condemning Jesus for, not for disobeying the law, but disobeying these other traditions and things that they've set up for themselves. And so Jesus, again, chastises them. He says, "You leave the commandments of God and hold the traditions of men." And so he gets on their case about this. He said, verse 10, he said, "For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles your father or mother must surely die.' But you say, if a man tells his father or mother, 'Whatever you have is gained to me is kaborim,' that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or his mother, thus making him void the word of God by your traditions that you have handed down, and many such things you do." So Jesus is saying sometimes our cultural conflicts and church rules can override or come in conflict with God's commandments, right? Where following these causes us to fail at following God's standards. So he's chastising them for adding these extra religious things on top of what they're supposed to do. And in doing so, you're neglecting the other things that God's commanded you to do. And so that's kind of the issue there. So you have the issue about dirty hands there, and then dirty hearts is kind of the next piece. He called the people to him and said to them again, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There's nothing outside of a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things coming out of a person are what defiles him." And when he entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about this parable. And he said to them, "Are you without understanding? Do you not see what goes into a person from the outside cannot defile them, since it enters into his heart, not into his heart, but into his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean." And he said, "What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All of these come from within, and they defile a person." We studied this in youth group one time, and one of the things we had to do was you had to take the passage and kind of reword it for yourself and how you would say it. And one girl wrote, she said, what's down in the well comes up in the bucket. And that was her way of saying what's in your heart is what comes out, and that's what's really the issue. If you remember, who's the author of this book? It's John Mark, written from Peter's perspective, right? Who's the one who has issue with food later on in Acts? It's Peter. It's interesting that Peter, right? Peter's there. Peter gets this before he gets that vision. He apparently has enough commentary to say, and that's where Jesus declared everything clean. And maybe he's like going back and like this is an edit later. And by the way, I should put this in parentheses here to add that because I missed it before, right? But Peter's the one who's there. And then Peter's the one in Acts 10 that has the same kind of issue. So the issue is an issue of the heart. You have the Gentile inclusion there in verses 24 through 30. This is our 12th miracle that happens. Remember, there's 18 miracles that happen in Mark's book. This is the 12th one. They're really front-loaded towards the beginning of the book. We'll get through, hopefully, 17 tonight, so that leaves only one more later on. This is the same Gentile woman. It's also interesting, right, what happens if you take these two stories in Acts, right? Peter's up on the roof. He gets a vision, and 3 times he's told, take and eat, right? Therefore, he's supposed to get that these are clean. What you thought was unclean is clean, and you can partake in that. Then he gets Cornelius' servants come and tell him, and he puts those pieces together later once Cornelius tells him this story. In his gospel, he puts this story talking about food laws and how Jesus is talking about what comes from the inside is what makes you unclean, not what you intake. What's the next thing that he talks about? A Gentile woman coming to faith. And so that parallels kind of what's going on in Acts chapter 10. You have this woman who comes out. The woman was a Gentile. I'm not even going to try to say that. A Scythian. Don't quote me on that. By birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the child be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and to throw it to the dogs." We talked about this story in Matthew. Matthew uses the same story. But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child in the bed and the demon gone. So here's an example, right? If you weren't looking at this story in a bigger picture, right, reading these big snippets of that wouldn't be something necessarily you'd be able to catch because you just think they're these isolated narratives. But Mark, as an author, right, is speaking theologically as well as telling narrative pieces. There's times where he's using real stories that happened, and we do that too. It's called sermon illustrations, right? When you tell something that happened in your life to illustrate a theological point, both of those things are true, right? The theological statement you're trying to convey is true, and so is the story. And so Mark's putting those pieces together somewhat in that way. He heals a deaf man there in 7, verse 31 through 37. That's the 13th miracle. I just like the last kind of line, last verse there. He says, "And then they were astonished beyond measure, saying, 'He does all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak.'" Jesus feeds the 4,000 there in chapter 8. These stories go together too. So like the feeding of the 5,000, right, where you went from sending out a ministry to ministry report and all these different things. These three stories go together, and they're all telling kind of a point two in how he has them put together. I should go back. Oh, I missed one. Well, that could be why. The feeding of the 5,000, again, is 8, 1 through 10. In those days when, again, a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, "I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat." And so the same kind of thing that he talks about there. They eat and they were satisfied in verse 8. And there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away, and immediately he got up in the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmath. I was ahead of myself. The next section goes together. So we'll do, here's your sign. This is the Pharisees again, come and beg, began to argue with him, seeking for a sign from heaven to test him. And like we talked about last time, like he's like, I don't know if you were here, like there was a couple of things that took place, right? There were some times where like I was in a house and I healed a guy who was dropped through a roof. Maybe you remember a guy dropped through a roof and you yelled at me for telling him to get up his pallet and walk, right? There's a couple of things that happened. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, got into the boat, and went to the other side. He then warns about the leaven of the Pharisees. Now they had gotten in the boat, and they had only one loaf with them on the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began to discuss one with another the fact that they had no bread. And he does the same thing he did before, which he takes out his palm and it says, "Insert forehead here." And he does this because the last guys, he just like has this deep sigh. He's like, what? And now the disciples are having the same kind of thing. He says, and Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear?" This is the same kind of thing that he's brought up to the Pharisees before, right? When he's quoted Isaiah and some of those where he says, "You're with eyes and not seeing, with ears not hearing," right? You're not understanding what's going on. "Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves and the 5,000, how baskets full, and how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 12. "And the 7 and the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not understand?" So he's asking about the Pharisees and leaven of bread, but the point is you don't see and you don't understand. The next story is about the healing of a blind man. They came to Bethsaida, and some of the people brought him a blind man and a beggar to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him home, saying, Do not enter the village." This is the only miracle that's recorded that we have that's a two-phase miracle. It's the only time where he heals him halfway and then he gets some of his hearing. This is the only one that we have out of all the Gospels. So maybe there's a theological thing that he's saying here, right? You don't see. He has this story about this guy who's starting to see, and then you'll see the disciples begin to get it. Not completely, but the next story goes with that. Sometimes we talk about sight. Sight is a metaphor for understanding, and the miracle shows and mirrors the incomplete understanding that the disciples have. Peter's confession of Jesus. This is why I put this in this section and moved it out of the other one. So this is the last piece of this section. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And when he asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" A lot of times you'll see Jesus will ask a question, then use that as a teaching opportunity. So that's like the entrance into something that's going on, whether that's against the Pharisees, whether it's with the disciples, whatever that is. And they told him, "John the Baptist," and others say Elijah, and others say one of the prophets. So all of these answers here are from the crowd, and they were wrong, and they indicate that the identity and the mission of Jesus remained largely misunderstood and veiled to the people. And then he asked him, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. You have ears, but you don't hear. You have eyes, but you don't see. Here's a story about a guy who started to see what's going on, and now the disciples start to see who Jesus is, and that's the end of that section. So you are the Christ. So the question is, who is Jesus? The answer to the question posed in the beginning is, you are the Christ. That's the end of that section. The next section is on the way to Galilee. This is 8:31 through the rest of chapter 10. Jesus is going to foretell his death and resurrection 3 times in the section. He's going to have a spot where the disciples are confused about something, and then he's going to have lessons on discipleship from these different narratives, and that's going to happen 3 times throughout this section. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days again. And he said this plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So Peter's now the man who sees trees walking around. Right? He's starting to see, but he's not getting it just yet. Peter gets rebuked, and he says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." A reference to how he would die, and that's the first veiled reference to that in the book. "For whoever would save his life would lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." And so you have the foretelling of his death and resurrection here the first time, followed by the transfiguration, a greater revelation of who he is. Again, like we talked about in Matthew when we went there. So Jesus was up on the mountain. Oh, I shouldn't have skipped ahead that far. Jesus was up on the mountain, right? The transfiguration happens. And then Jesus is coming down from the mountain with Peter, James, and John, right? Those 3. And as he comes down the mountain, the next story starts. And so it's hard because Mark sometimes is giving you it feels like it's like compressing and then expanding, right? Something's happening really fast, and then he's pushing all these little stories together. And these are all one after another chronologically. And this is one of those times, right? So Jesus is up on the mountain. As he comes down on the mountain, you have the story where the man says, "Help, I believe, help my unbelief," right? When they came down to the disciples, so Jesus is coming down and the other 9 are there, they saw the great crowd around them, the scribes arguing with them, and immediately all the crowd when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And some from the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able to." So the 9 are there. They're supposed to cast this demon out. They're not able to cast the demon out while Jesus is having the transfiguration happen. And they answered him, and he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." Jesus continues on. Jesus asked the Father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood, and it was often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." So this man brought his son to Jesus with the intent that Jesus was going to heal his son. The physician assistant was not able to do the job, and so now he's questioning the authority of the physician and saying, "If your trainees can't do it, I'm not maybe I came to the wrong guy?" And so he's like, "If you can do anything, that would be nice. I don't know if you can, but if you can, please do it." And Jesus said to him, "If I can, all things are possible for the one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." When Jesus saw the crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And so Jesus is able to put out the demon. The disciples are like, "What happened? Why did it work for you and it didn't work for us?" One commentary suggested that they had been relying on past ministry experience and were not trusting on God, but trusting on their own ability. And that's the point of the story. The point of the story is you still have to pray, you still have to trust in me to be able to do the things. Just because you were successful yesterday doesn't mean that it's going to work today. You have to continually putting your reliance on me. Jesus again foretells about his death and resurrection. So the second time in 30 and 32, verse 32, "But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him." So again, they're not really getting what's going on. They're too scared to even ask Jesus. Peter at least knows that, like, within the group, right, there's questions about what's going on, but they're not willing to bring it up to Jesus. There's the question of who is the greatest. He'll say that highest positions in the kingdom are achieved through volunteer service to others, not through status. One who freely attends to the needs of others, not in a compulsory manner like a slave, but willingly and joyfully. It's kind of the point of that when they ask who's the greatest. And so what happens is Jesus is at a house, the disciples are coming back from doing something, they're arguing and saying, "No, I'm better than you," and maybe this is stemmed from the fact that 3 of them got to go see Jesus at the Transfiguration. Ooh, you get to go see Jesus. And so they're arguing with each other who's the greatest. Jesus is like sitting at the window seeing these bickering children come to the house, and this is where the conversation comes up. So Jesus asks them, they're not telling him what's going on, and he's saying the same idea. The servant attitude is what's coming out here in this passage. Verses 38 through 41. I just called collaborators or co-laborers. John said to the teacher, "Teacher, I saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." It's interesting. 9 of them tried to cast out a demon. It didn't work, and now they're mad that somebody else gets to do it. And they're like, "Why does he get to do it? I didn't. You go tell him to stop. We're not allowed to do that without you." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a mighty work in my name will soon be able afterwards to speak evil of me. For the one who is not against us is for us. For truly I say to you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you belong to Christ will by no means lose his reward." The man again did what the 9 were failed to do in 9:14 through 29. And Jesus here cautions us to be careful to quickly judge those who follow Jesus outside of our own circles. He said, "Be generous to those who truly follow and seek to obey Jesus, who are outside of your circle of friends, your tribe, your group, right? God knows and sees even the smallest acts that we do, and those who follow as servants of Christ." And so just being careful how they're like upset that they're having success in ministry, and he wants them to stop, right? But you're on the same team, right? And so there is a place to be gracious towards people in that. If you go on the internet, that's not true, but at least for Jesus here, that's true. The cost of discipleship there is in verses 9, chapter 9, verse 42 through 50. Going to move a little faster here so we can get through all this, because the teachings on divorce here, God's design is that marriage would be between one man and one woman for life, and that broken marriages would be reconciled, and that forgiveness would be granted. It's kind of his outline here in this passage. That's also what it says in Hosea 1 through 3, 1 Corinthians 7, 10 through 11. And we talked about this a little bit when we looked at Matthew previously. Verses 13 through 16 is talking about the children. The children, right, are coming to Jesus. The disciples get angry. They tell him to go away. And Jesus said, no, let them come, right? The idea is that the mercy of God extends to all people, including those who are not esteemed or elevated in a certain society. The doors of the kingdom are open to all, and God cares even for the undesirable and unimportant. And so let them come. The rich young man there is in 10:17 through 31. And he was setting on a journey, and a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments: do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother." And he said to him, "Teacher, I have kept all these from my youth." And Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said to him, "You lack one thing. Go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me." Disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. If you look at this, this rich man kept the horizontal commandments, right? I don't defraud my neighbor, right? I'm good to my neighbor, right? But he was neglecting the vertical commandments. He was neglecting to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. He was not putting God first. He had an idol. And so Jesus lovingly, right? Love sometimes tells you the hard things that you need to hear that you don't want to hear. But in love, Jesus tells him that he has his priorities out of whack. And so he challenges him to give up his idol. Talked about killing idols Sunday, right? And follow after Jesus. The purpose is not that we're all supposed to sell everything and become poor. The purpose is there's something that may be holding you back from following God. Whatever that is, if it's money, that's the thing you've got to get rid of. That's the thing that you've got to kill, is the love of that thing. Wealth in this society was seen as divine favor, and the disciples were like, well, if he can't be saved, who can? Right? Because the idea is, if God's favor rests on this man who's got all the money, I'm broke, and God doesn't love him. Like, what? If people who have God's favor couldn't join the kingdom, then who could? And that was kind of their thinking in that. Jesus says in verse 39, "Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brother or sister or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands, with persecution, and in the age to come eternal life. But many who will be first will be last, and the last first. The idea is that nothing that you give up now, you will regret in eternity. You are giving up now for a greater reward later. Jesus foretells his death for the third time here in 32 through 34. Just make a note real quick, and it says, and they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. Right, so this whole section is on the way. So we're going from Galilee to Jerusalem, and he's starting to make his way there now. He foretells his death again. He talks about godly surrender here. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one in the left hand in your glory. And Jesus is like, I feel like I just said something like the last will be first and the first will be last. I mean, maybe I don't remember. Like I just said that, right? And so it's coming up again here. Jesus talks about godly surrender in verse 42. He says, and Jesus called them and said to them, You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great ones exercise their authority over them. But it shall not be among you. But whoever would be greatest among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave to all. And then we have the theme verse of Mark. It said, For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so Jesus is bringing up the same idea again. He's giving himself as the example there. Verses 46 through 42, you have Jesus heals blind Bartimaeus. This is the 16th miracle. This is Jesus' last recorded healing in Mark, and it concludes this section on discipleship and functions as a narrative and a theological statement, just like the blind man in Mark 8. So eventually the disciples would have clear sight and understanding like Bartimaeus did. They came to Jericho, and he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd. Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, Call him. Called the blind man, saying to him, Take heart, get up, he is calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, What do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, Go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight. He covered his sight and followed him on the way. So again, this man is healed and then follows Jesus, becomes part of this group. That's the end of the section, right? And so again, a narrative piece that's making a theological statement as they start to get sight on who Jesus is. We now come to mostly the last section, which is the whole section on Jerusalem. This idea of the suffering servant. We're going to go through this quickly because a lot of this we talked about 2 weeks ago when we did Matthew, because remember, Mark is the source material for a lot of what Matthew's saying, so a lot of the pieces are the same, a lot of the story is the same, and so we'll go through this quickly here. You have the triumphal entry at the beginning of this section, so he's now in Jerusalem in Judea, right? We've made it down there. The triumphal entry is in 1 through 11. He curses the fig tree there in 12 and 14. Remember, we talked about the differences in Matthew, right, where Matthew has this kind of as one story. Mark has it broken up, and because in Matthew it's like, and immediately the tree withered, right? Mark's going to tell us that he comes by the next day and the tree's dead. I don't care if you touch a tree and it dies tomorrow. It's close enough to be immediately, right? So don't quibble about those things. But This is the 17th miracle in the book. So there's one more left as we get towards the end. The withering of the fig tree. He cleanses the temple there. A lot of this section, especially chapters 11 and 12, are episodes of Jesus in conflict with various influential religious groups. So those that we went over at the beginning are going to come into play here. There's a contrast between self-righteous religion and wholehearted devotion to God. The temple is the focal point for a lot of these narrative pieces, so it's in and around the temple that these are happening. And this section is kind of a summary of Jesus' teaching during Tuesday and Wednesday, and the growing hostility that the religious leaders have for him. And so all of those things are happening kind of as the narrative moves forward here. The cleansing of the temple, verse 17 real quick. This is Jesus' complaint as he sees them selling different sacrificial animals and changing money and all these different things. He said, and when he was teaching them and saying to them, is not written, my house shall be a house of prayer for all the nations. It's interesting that Mark uses that word all, right? Because what he's in is he's in the Gentile court area where not just Jewish believers come, but all believers come. And so he's upset that you're stopping these other people from coming to him. You can write Isaiah 56, verse 7 there as a reference, and Jeremiah 7:11 are kind of the two that he references. So the first one, my house should be called a house of prayer for all the nations. That's Isaiah 56:7. And then Jeremiah 7:11 is, but you have made it into a den of robbers. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowds were astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. So the beginning of this pushback from the religious leaders in Jerusalem specifically, right, looking for a way to destroy him. Again, they're looking for it because he's pulling the crowd away, not because of necessarily what he's saying, right? They're going to use that against him and say, well, he's committing blasphemy, and that's the charge that they're going to give him later. But it's because they fear the people, and so they're trying to destroy Jesus that way. The lesson of the fig tree there is in 11:20 through 26. And then Jesus' authority is challenged there. 11, the next two pieces are kind of together too. It's kind of like A and B. His authority is challenged. Again, he came into Jerusalem and he was talking in the temple. So he's in the temple again. The chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, by what authority are you doing these things, or who gives you the authority to do them? And so again, this was the story about John, right? If you say it's from man, then we're going to be upset at you. If you say it's from God, then why am I not following what God is telling you to do? And so his authority is challenged there, and so they can't answer his question. So he's like, well, then I'm not going to answer your question. And then the parable of the tenants there in 12:1 through 12. This is the same thing. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for the winepress to build a tower, and leased it to tenants who went away to another country. And when the season came, he sent servants to the tenants to get some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another servant, and they struck him on the head, and they treated him with shamefulness. And they sent another, and they killed him. And so with many others, so they beat, and some they killed. And he still had one other, a beloved son. Finally he sent him, saying, they will respect my son. So again, I've sent you prophets. I've sent you all these guys who told you what was happening, who gave you my word. You rejected it. You killed them. And now I'm sending my last representative, my beloved son. But the tenants said to one another, this is their heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? Will he come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others? Have you not read in Scripture, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Remember, that's Psalm 118 that we read the other week. And they were seeking to arrest him, but they feared the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So they left and went their way. paying taxes to Caesar there. That's the Pharisees and the Herodians. Right, so the Pharisees are kind of anti-Roman, the Herodians are kind of pro-Roman. So you can see where this is kind of a weird story because you have these two people that have conflicting interests around the same question are coming to Jesus, but they're ultimately coming because they don't like Jesus. This is where it's render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar and render unto God's the things that are God. Verse 18 through 22 is about failing to understand word and power. The Sadducees came to him who say that there is no resurrection. So again, if you're a Jewish person, you already know that. This is a note to a Roman audience on the difference between some of these and why this people group is important. And they asked him a question saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife, but he leaves no child, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. So he talks about the 7 marriages that go on. And then they're like, in the resurrection, when they rise again, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had her as a wife. Well, they don't believe in the resurrection. It's a trick question coming from people who don't even believe the thing. Jesus said to them, Is this not the reason you are wrong? Because 1, you neither know the scriptures nor the power of God. And so he gives 2 reasons why they're wrong, and then he answers them in reverse. So it's you don't know the scriptures or the power of God. Then he answers power of God and then the scripture. For when they rise from the dead, neither will they marry or they given in marriage, but they are like the angels in heaven, which they don't believe in. He's like, well, you have no category for this because you don't even believe that this is going on, but this is what it's like. And from the dead being raised, you have not read the books of Moses, which is interesting because we said that they focus on those first 5 books. And so he uses the 5 books that they would accept to refute their own claims. He's not bringing up Psalms or Isaiah or a different book. He's using the books that they would include as authoritative and saying, you don't even get the own book, the few that you do pick, right? You even get those wrong. You only have 5 and you mess them up. In the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong. The greatest commandment here is in 12:28 through 34. Interesting fact about this is he's talking to one of the scribes, right? And this is one of the few times where he has a semi-positive interaction with one of these groups, right? He asks him, what's the greatest commandment? He gives him the answer. And the man responds and says, you are right, teacher. You've said truly that he is one. So he doesn't say God, he says he. So he's avoiding that as a good Jewish person, as the custom would be, right? You've truly said that he is one and there is no one besides him. And to love him with all the heart and with all your understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor yourself. And he adds this, is much more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. So to love God in this way and to love your neighbor is better than the sacrifices you're supposed to make and the sacrifices that you get to make. And Jesus responds and says, when Jesus saw the answer, he answered wisely. He said to him, you were not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared to ask him a question. We don't know if he became a believer, right? But we know that he's at least sensitive in a way that some of these other religious leaders are not. He talks about the son of David, right? And talking about how he was going to be God and man there in 35 through 37. He warns them to keep away from the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees. He says, beware the scribes who are like to walk around in long robes and like greeting in the marketplaces, and they have the best seats at the synagogues and the places of honors of the feast, who devour widows' houses and pretense makes long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. And then the last story for tonight is titled Follow the Money. There's a widow. Jesus is at the temple again, because a lot of these stories are around the temple. A poor widow came to put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. So there's a bunch of rich people dumping a bunch of things in the offering box. We talked about this, I don't remember when, months ago, whatever. They have these big metal trumpets, and for some reason I think of like at the mall when you put the coin in and it swirls around, right? It's making a loud clanking noise because it's metal. And so as you dump in your large sum of coins, you hear all this clinking and clanking around, right? So there's these rich people dumping in all their coins, and a widow comes in, and she puts in 2 small copper pennies. This is the smallest Jewish coin, and a lepta was worth about 1/64th of a Roman denarius, which is a day's wage. So her contribution is 1/64th of a day's wage. If you take $15 an hour at 8 hours a day, it's $120. It works out to $1.88 is what she ended up putting in. So you clink, 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 and you have $1.88 going in. Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, the poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Others had given out of their wealth, and it came at little personal cost to them, but for her, out of her poverty, she gave all that she had. In giving to God sacrificially, she completely entrusted herself to Him to provide for her needs." Again, this goes back to what we talked before. It's an issue of the heart, right? It's not about the money. It's not about where the money goes, but where your heart is. But where your money is shows where your heart is going. And so he kind of talks about there in chapter 12. That's the end of chapter 12. Next week, the goal is to get through the end of Mark. And we're kind of in a break in between there. I think there's a 2-day break between Mark and Luke. And so we're going to finish Mark out because there's only 4 more chapters of Mark. And then we're going to do the overview of Luke. So when you come into Luke, you'll have an idea of the big structure pieces that will go through that.